Welcome to Off the Shelf. I'm your host, Yvonne Wolf. Today, our special guest is John Cowlin. He is a Glenbrook South English teacher since 2002, and John is here to talk about his book, Monster City. Welcome, John.
Thank you for having me.
And why put a monster in Monster City?
Okay.
Can you tell us about that?
Sure. So, when I was a kid, I was definitely not a reader. And my parents were pretty disappointed about that. My mom had high hopes for me. They took me to Paris. I thought it was really boring. They took me to England. I thought it was worse. And my mom had always had these hopes that I would turn into like a sophisticate, loving art and literature. And I read some of like the Boxcar Kids and Encyclopedia Brown, but that was about it as a kid. But movies I thought were awesome. And so I was born in the early 70s, so I was really a VCR kid. Like if you're my age, then you remember getting your first VCR, and it was a top loader. You know what I mean? Like those things go in the top, and then the buttons were these big mechanical. Okay, so the first movie we ever watched on VHS was a horrible movie called The Wilderness Family, and there was even The Wilderness Family Part 2, and they were both bad movies. But I thought they were great because it was like you got to start the movie and you got to stop the movie as opposed to just watching on TV, right?
And you can replay it and you can recite the lines.
And I don't know if cable was out at the time, but I did not have cable as a kid. We had this VCR.
No.
So, right. So I would just go around from video store to video store, getting my hands on whatever I could. And I had absolutely no taste. Like everything was awesome. It didn't matter if everything was great.
Cult movies like that.
Cult movies and then old movies.
B movies and old movies, yeah.
Everything to me was supposed to be, it didn't matter how cheap the movie was, it didn't matter how old it was. In my mind, the first movie I ever saw in the movie theater was Star Wars. And now I saw it in the theater and I walked out like not knowing what I had, like, I was maybe like 6 at the time. Forget exactly. I think about 6. I don't even know what that happened to me. Like it totally blew me away. So, these movies, it didn't matter what the budget was or anything. To me, everything was supposed to be great because it was a movie, and that's how. And so I'd be watching these old black and white movies, and I got into the old Universal Studios. I know they're remaking them right now. The Tom Cruise Mummy movie's coming out. But there was actually a movie back in the 1940s called The Mummy. Then The Mummy's Hand, then Curse of the Mummy. There's 5 Mummy movies. And there was Dracula movies, Frankenstein movies, Wolfman movies, Invisible Man movies.
There's a whole series.
And back, I'm telling you something here, almost 100 years before Marvel decided to have Iron Man meet Captain America in a movie, they already made Wolfman meets Frankenstein. And they had these movies where these characters start being in, you know what I'm saying, like in each other's movies.
Yes,
so House of Frankenstein had Dracula in it, and House of Dracula had Wolfman in it. Okay, these movies are great. But I also would watch these old detective movies, like Maltese Falcon.
Yes.
You know,
Bogart.
Bogart movies, right?
Yes.
And to me, as an unsophisticated kid, just ingesting movies as like food, to me, black and white was its own genre.
Yes.
So like, to me, every black and white movie was happening in the same place at the same time in the same universe.
I can see that.
So it made total sense to me that Humphrey Bogart would bump into the Wolfman.
Yes.
Like he'd have his hat on, you know, that felt.
Boris Karloff would walk by.
Karloff would walk by, and then, you know, it was
Abbott Costello.
Yeah.
Right?
And then Abbott Costello made a movie, Abbott Costello made Frankenstein, and that was really one of the first crossovers where it's like a comedy movie.
And detective, right.
Yeah, there was a detective element to it.
Yeah, crime.
Yeah. And then, but it was the same actors. It was Lon Chaney Jr. was still a Wolfman. Okay, this is boring. But anyways, it's the same actors, okay? And so as an adult, as a grown person years ago, like 10, 15 years ago, I was just thinking about it as a kid, like, oh, well, you know, isn't that funny how I used to think that? And then I got to thinking, like, well, what if that was a story? You know what I mean? Like, would I like to see that story? Yeah. And the answer was, yeah, like that's a movie I wish I could go see. I wish I could go see Humphrey Bogart meet the Wolfman. So that's basically what
Yes.
It's basically what the book is.
Yes, I can. This is very interesting because I see a very visual book. Even though it has very little descriptions, there's a lot of scenes that's set up.
Yeah.
The details are given very sparingly, but then
Yes.
you can see the picture of the scene.
So that's coming from two places. You ready? Okay. Place number one is, since I became an English teacher, I've read books. But when I was a kid, I didn't read that many books. And so I really think that my whole perception of what a story is, I really think it was so informed by all those movies I used to watch that to me, a story is supposed to take 2 hours to tell. Like, and one of my biggest fears, I had two fears while reading this book, and one of my biggest fears was, it's not going to be long enough. Like, how is this going to be a book?
Yes.
Because I had all the scenes of a movie in my head, like this is how the movie would go. Like this is the pace, this is how the movie works.
Yes.
And I think that's why it's so, because it's based off of that Bogart, Raymond Chandler style of movie, like The Big Sleep, like and the dialogue, it's all dialogue driven.
Yeah, I noticed that about the dialogue. In fact, your book made me think of radio shows, radio plays like Johnny Dollar and these other detectives who people used to listen and know the way they talk, the pace of the way they talk.
Right.
And the description you get of the scene is based on dialogue. People are talking, and then you're starting to picture this.
Here's where part of this comes from. Part of it, and I think this just goes for books. Part of it comes from what point of view are you going to tell the story in? Yeah. First person, third person, limited, unlimited, etc. And because the old, and I know I'm saying it based off a movie, but I also went and read all the, I went through a phase where I read all of these 1940s and 50s. In the film world, they're called film noir. In the book world, it's called hard-boiled. So, because film noir is a film term, but it's basically kind of based off of these pulp books that were already being created, and they're called hard-boiled. Okay.
I see. Uh-huh.
So, those books were usually first person. So that said that my book had to be first person, because I wanted to sound like, it was an emulation. I wanted to sound like one of these old books.
The style. Yes, the style.
But as soon as you make it first person, at least this is my experience, and I don't know much, but this is my experience of writing this thing, is that as soon as it became first person, it's like, well, what would the person say and what would the person think? Right. And if this character, the main character, he wouldn't be noticing like 1,000 details in the room. He wouldn't care. The guy in the book wouldn't care about this stuff. Right. So the only details included are the details that he would notice because of who he is. So therefore, it really limits to like what, details.
Can be told.
Yeah, right.
Can be told. Yeah.
It's almost like rules. Mm-hmm. Like the book had rules with it, and one of the rules is it has to sound like an old Raymond Chandler book, and another rule was everything has to be seen through his character, and so.
So he's not interested in women's clothing. He just knows she went to a high-end store. Like
that.
Yeah.
Right. She went to a high-end store. Right.
I don't know what kind of fur it was. Just she was wearing a fur coat.
Right. Something like that.
That's very clever. I like how you are telling more of this character by what they don't see, what he doesn't see. Right.
So a term that I use, and I use this with my students. I teach film studies also.
Yes.
So a term that I don't know if I made this up, if I read it somewhere, but I've been using it for years. I call it a keystone detail. And a keystone is when you have, architecturally speaking, when you have like an arc, an arch, like a stone bridge. Mm-hmm. All of it, and I'm talking about the olden days, really the reason an arch works so well is because it all leans on itself. And it's gravity, the irony of it, what keeps it up is gravity pulling it down, and it presses against itself.
Down, yes, yeah.
But supposedly there's this thing called a keystone, and that's like if you pull that out, the rest of it collapses. So I call it a keystone detail. When I'm watching a movie, a good movie, not because I now know the difference between good movies and bad movies, but when I'm watching a good movie or reading a good book, I really think that a good storyteller. You include one keystone detail can tell you everything you have to know about everything going on. So instead of making a laundry list, you know, if you were to describe this room, there's literally 1,000 things.
Details, yeah. So what
you
would
know,
make it,
like
yeah.
you know, all these books and stuff, and you know, you can. Oh, here's my book. That's great. So you can like, you know, you can mention every of these books by title, but what's the point to it? The point is like, well, do you want to make this scene depressing? Do you want to make it funny?
Yes.
So that's the key detail you pick, and it brings all this baggage with it. And therefore, you don't have to say more about it. You just describe this lamp, and maybe you've described the whole room.
Yes. Well, that's a very good tip on economy, because many writers have trouble paring it down. You know, editing work takes so much time.
Well, maybe it's a good tip. I think it's a good tip, but like I said, I also was afraid that the book wasn't going to be long enough. So when I read a book that's like open a book, like it's like these thick books, I wonder like how the guy even did it. Like, doesn't even make any sense to me. Like, how's the story not done by page 200? It totally confounds me.
It's a very interesting approach, because
Well,
I think most of the time, because writing poetry is being able to be economical with your words.
It totally is. Poetry, and I'm not good at poetry. I'm not even good at reading poetry. I can barely read a poem. And ironically, my favorite poem is really long. It's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner. It's like a whole, it's like books, it's like book length almost.
Yeah.
But poetry is more like, if a book is like a soup, then poetry is more like a stew where it's all been like, or a sauce where it's been like cooked down and it's kind of thick. And one taste, it's already heavy enough.
Yes.
You know, you don't.
Like a bisque, lobster bisque.
Yeah, thicker.
Wow.
Poetry's thicker than a lobster bisque. It's like what's that? It's like a hollandaise sauce.
Let's talk about the publishing process.
Yeah.
Was that difficult for you to find a publisher, or?
It was super easy because I worked with a guy who owned a publishing company here in Glenview, and then he said, well, let me read the book, and then he read it, and then he published it. So it was super easy for me.
That was a week.
I understand that it's usually not very easy.
No.
That usually you have to like send a bunch of letters out and get a bunch of slips that say it's not good enough.
Yes. Did you want to get it published then? I mean, was it?
Yeah.
So you weren't looking, but you just knew people in the English department anyway.
Well,
Jay Amber was.
Yeah. So Jay Amber got to make a press. He's I know him, and I said, would you? I worked on this thing for a lot of years because it actually took me about 10 years to write it.
Wow.
Which is pretty pitiful for 200 pages. Like if you did like a sentence a day, you could still finish earlier than I did. But my problem is that I'd never written a book before, and that's problem number one. And problem number two is I felt like because it was a detective story, that every single thread had to be followed throughout the book and then have an ending. Each thread had to have its own little moment at the end.
I see.
And maybe that's not the case. Like when I'm reading books, I realize like, well, I don't notice every little thread, but that's how I felt like it had to be.
Yeah.
So at about 30 threads, I got overwhelmed with it. And I put it down, and I would come back to it every couple of years. Like, okay, well, let's try to, and I would read like I was about half done. And I'd read the 100 pages, like, okay, you know what? I'm just going to go knock this thing out. I got a good weekend. I've been thinking about it for 3 more years. Certainly I can go do it. And I'd sit down, I'd read that first 100 pages. I'd get through about page 90, and I'd say, oh, forget it. Like, I can't do it. Like, there's too many threads.
Yeah.
And then it was just one summer, and I decided, like, you know what? I got a piece of paper, and I drew lines that were threads.
Yes.
And I already had notebooks filled up.
Okay, so you have a map. You made a map for this?
I have 3 fat notebooks filled with notes for this book. And I think it was procrastination. Like instead of writing the book, I could just make more notes. Mm-hmm. So I did have a map. I drew out an entire map of the whole city because I'm making up a city.
Yes.
And so when I'm...
Where's City Hall? Where's, yeah.
Right, like if I want him to go somewhere and I have to describe the route, I thought like, well, I'll draw a map of this. And the map got really detailed. And then also I had a rule about the monsters. So it takes, you know, it's a 1950s hard-boiled detective book, but it takes place in a city with monsters. But here's the key I wanted to be. Like to me, here is the main thing. That the monsters are, it's totally normal to be a monster there.
Yes.
It is not like it's not like a horror movie.
No.
Where things are going to pop out at you and things are hiding. It's like the mafia are all vampires. And the street sweepers are just zombies and they've bolted their mouth shut with a piece of iron and put a broom in their hands and they just wander around sweeping.
That's probably a very good imagery for bloodsuckers to be mafia.
Right, that's what I thought. Like it's, what's the word? A metaphor.
Yes, a metaphor.
You know what I mean? That's in my business, in the English teaching business, we call it a metaphor. Right. So, right? So I also had another rule. Because the book took place in the 1950s, I was only going to use monsters that were, I wasn't going to invent any monsters.
Yes.
Only monsters already made, at least riffs on them. And then monsters made before the 1950s. So, like no Freddy Krueger type guy.
Right.
No Jason, no serial killers. That was all like after Psycho.
Right.
So the story starts off with, it's a mummy, but he's in a gray suit. Like he's a good looking dude.
Yes.
But he's just a couple thousand years old and he's from Egypt.
Right.
And he's hiring our hero because he thinks his wife is cheating on him. And she's kind of like a Bride of Frankenstein lady. He had her specially made from a mad scientist. Yes. And he put in his special order. Like,
she's very gorgeous.
She's super gorgeous, and she's a special order. It's exactly how he wants it. You know what I mean?
Yes.
But it starts off. She's been undressing in the bathroom, not in the room that he's in. And he thinks that, well, I don't know why she's undressing in this other room. If I made her special order, she should be dressing in front of me because that's how I ordered it. So maybe she's cheating on someone. So he hires our detective to follow the Bride of Frankenstein-like lady. She's not called Bride of Frankenstein, but follow her around and see if she's cheating on me. So our hero does. And she's cheating on him with the Wolfman during a full moon. I mean, it's serious business during a full moon, cheating with the Wolfman. Right?
Yes.
And then throughout the book, you get to meet more characters. You know, like
it's a crime.
The mafia pops up. You know, all these different kind of things pop up. But I had a rule like, okay, I might have Invisible Man there. I could have him. I could have Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde. Yes. He can be in there. Yes. 1950s. So I can have giant radioactive ants. Technically, that's allowed, but I didn't put them in there. And then I'm definitely allowed to have inbred hillbilly mutants. Like that was a big. I was waiting for the inbred hillbilly mutant chapter the whole time I was writing it. Like this is what I'm working towards, is the inbred hillbilly mutant chapter. Do you read that? I don't think you read it yet.
Not yet.
All right, this one's a humdinger, and this chapter is the reason why the book's not allowed in the school library.
Well, let's talk about the cover of your book. You designed your own cover. Did you?
I did.
And how did you do that? Did you have this cover in mind before you finished the book?
No.
No? Okay.
So also, I can't really draw very good. So I knew that I didn't want to pay someone to make my cover. So I wanted to do it myself, but I also didn't know how to draw pictures. So I made this painting, and it's hanging in my kitchen wall right now. It's about 6 feet high. It's about 4 feet wide. And it's huge. It's a big painting.
Yeah, that's a mural. That's not a painting.
Well, it's in a frame.
Okay.
But I don't know what you call it. It's just a giant painting.
Yeah.
I'd be okay with calling it a mural, but it's not. It's a painting. And I'm like, okay, this is going to be it. This is going to be great. It's a guy. He's walking out. It's kind of like this, it's just like a silhouette of a man with a gun walking out from a shadow, and the city's behind him.
Yes. And wearing a hat, of course, in the 50s.
Yeah, like the 50s hat and the gun and stuff like that. And then, like 2 days before we're supposed to go to press, I realized there's no monsters on it, and this is a terrible cover. Like this is the worst cover you could ever imagine for a book called Monster City, a cover with no monsters. So I drew this one on a computer in about a day, and I like this one much better. It has action. He's running like action, and then do you see those the beautiful legs?
Yes.
They're green like Bride of Frankenstein, and they have
stitches
like Bride of Frankenstein.
And that's really what you need right now. I notice a lot of covers of books that they don't have.
Are horrible?
That they
oh
lack.
My God, there's so many bad covers out there. I think mine's pretty good, and I know I like it, but I wanted to look a little bit old-fashioned looking.
Yes.
I didn't want it to look too new. I wanted it to be
yeah.
kind of put in the like in the time period. I am a huge fan of book covers. I like book covers way more than books. I've gotten rid of, my wife and I are like, we got too much stuff. Let's get rid of some of the stuff. Let's.
Every American home.
Right. So I've gotten rid of most of my books, except my book collection is now just books of covers I like. Because I realize there's 3 kinds of books you have in your house. Books you've read that you'll never read again. Books you have that you will read. Books that you have that you haven't read and you will never read. So that's the only kind of books you have. So I try to get rid of all of them except for the middle one, books I haven't read that I'm going to read. Those are the ones I'm allowed to keep in my house. The rest of them, I don't really have a reason for it. But these books, I have maybe like 100 of them. The covers are so awesome. I really like the covers.
So do you think there's a sequel? Do you have because sometimes when you create a detective, you find that you can work with him, or you have a character who's waiting for you to throw another crime at him, right? So
this is the question that dozen of my readers have been asking me ever since all dozen read the book. Is there going to be another one? I have all the chapters on note cards taped to my office wall, and I have the whole book planned out. But I didn't start writing it. I wrote the first chapter, and then I took a pause. I don't know if I want to write this, because
you already have the city mapped out.
Yeah, I know, but I'm writing a different thing right now, and it doesn't have monsters in it. I thought maybe I should write something that's about real, like a real thing, something. So I'm writing a totally different thing, and maybe I'll come back to this someday. It depends on how this other thing turns out.
So you are working on something else, at least. Yeah.
Yeah, and I really like it. I've had a couple of ideas for stuff, and I've kind of worked with it, and I realized this is kind of a chore. But this one doesn't feel like a chore. This one feels like it's I'm really looking forward to how it turns out.
Okay.
There's no monsters in it. No supernatural monsters in it.
Did you get any help from others? Did you have an editor read your book before, or did you just have you work in a very nice environment?
Yeah, I had a friend at work. I had someone read the first half of it, give me some notes. Basically, my question was this. It was Jay Amberg, the guy who ended up publishing it. And this is years ago when he read the first half. My question was simply, is this even a book? Am I just an idiot with words on a page? Yeah. Is this even a thing? Does this sound like a book, or does it sound like just bad, And he said, well, I think it's a book. I go, well, that's great news, because that's what I was going for. And then I had a good friend at work read the whole thing, give me some notes. Some I agreed with, some I didn't. Jay had a good note too. Jay's note, and it was the note he gave me when he read the first half, and then years later he read the whole thing. It was the same note both times. He goes, because there's 2 main female characters in here. He goes, the one female character is totally boring. And I agreed with him. But I felt kind of stuck, because these stories usually have 2 females, like the femme fatale, the one who's
the exciting one.
Right, exciting, sexy, but dangerous, and probably kind of a bad person.
Right.
Then there's the good girl. Yes. And she's also pretty, but she's kind of innocent, a little naive. Yeah. A little boring, right.
Yes,
and that's why the guy's interested in the bad one, is because she's more exciting.
Right.
And actually, one thing I kind of struggled with is the female characters are pretty one-dimensional. I don't know if it's 2-dimensional. They're not 3-dimensional, whatever dimension that is. They're not good female characters.
They're static and not dynamic characters.
And I was kind of disappointed with myself. I'm a man of the 21st century. I think I should write female characters better than that. And I like them both. They're just not like, you wouldn't be like, oh man, good female characters. But then I got to thinking like, but you know what? I think I'm okay with it for this reason, because the whole thing is an emulation of a specific style.
Yes.
And I think that
An era, yeah.
an era, right. And therefore, like, here's a depressing thing that hit me. I hate exclamation points. Exclamation points, I think, they're terrible. We should barely have exclamation points, and I'll explain why. Oh my God, exclamation points. So here's the thing. Someone tweets you, and they go, it was so scary, right? Like, oh, I almost got, there was a truck. It was so scary, exclamation point. You're like, okay, it sounds like you were scared from a truck. That's a thing. But then they go, there was a truck. It was so scary, exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point. It's not like you're like, oh my God, I didn't know. Like, I knew about the truck. I didn't know it was a truck. Like, exclamation points do not make people feel anything. It's not like if you put a bunch of exclamation, like, it's not like if you propose to someone and go like, I love you. And like here's a note, like a Valentine's card. I love you, exclamation point. Oh man, can you believe that this bum only gave me 1 exclamation point? Like, I loved him 4 exclamation points, and Roger, my last boyfriend, loved me too. I think I gotta dump this guy and go back to Roger because he loves me more exclamation points. Exclamation points, in my opinion, usually come from weak writing. Like, your words aren't doing it for you.
Yes.
So you're trying to like give it some juice by throwing on some sticks at the end, and they don't cut the mustard. But here's where exclamation points work in fiction. Okay, here's where they work in everything, and here's where they work in fiction. They work to make things sarcastic. So if you say, nice shirt, exclamation point, a lot of times it sounds, in the right context, it sounds sarcastic. Mm-hmm. So it can make things sound sarcastic, and it can also raise volume. So if someone's yelling, you probably want an exclamation point just to say it was loud.
Yes.
Okay. So then someone asked me, like, well, how many, I was telling this to somebody one time, and someone goes, well, how many exclamation points did you use in your book? I'm like, that's a good question. I'm going to find out. I used like a lot of exclamation points. I was totally bummed out because I thought that exclamation points are for bad writers, and here I am using like 90 exclamation points in this book or something. It was like horrifying. And then here's what got even more depressing. I went through each one. Almost all of them are used by one of the female characters. And I'm using it.
Then you might hear
and she's just,
her voice.
And she's just being shrill. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Like, I'm writing that old stereotypical character from these movies. Mm-hmm. You know what I'm talking about?
Yes.
Like,
and the screaming and the
right,
sharp.
just kind of shrill and sharp and like, oh, I'm so scared, you know, that kind of a thing. So once again, I'm torn because I think I know why I did it, and I didn't do it consciously. I did it unconsciously, but I did it to emulate this style. But I'm glad the style's not there anymore. I mean, I'm glad that hopefully we're past that. You know, we are. Like, Wonder Woman's making big money at the box office. Like, we're a little bit past this, you know, 3-dimensional, you know, Furiosa from Mad Max Fury Road. Like, we have good female characters now.
Well, John, I think you're our first guest who ever apologized for your female characters.
I promise I'll do better with my female characters next time.
All right, we look forward to hearing about your next book. And thank you for being on the program.
Well, thanks for having me.
And thank you. And join us next time on Off the Shelf.